Welcome to Intersections. It's my pleasure today to welcome Lieutenant Colonels Eddie and Ginevra Vincent to the set. They are the divisional commander and the divisional director of women's ministries and the director of spiritual development for the Salvation Army in Newfoundland and Labrador, and they hold the rank of lieutenant colonel. Now, as an aside, for those who may not understand the structure of the Salvation Army, we parallel ranks as they do in the military. So when someone is ordained as a clergy in the Salvation Army, they are ordained with the rank of lieutenant, and they hold that for 5 years and then they become a captain. And after they have been in the ministry for 15 years, they become a major. After that, depending on the nature of the appointment and the administrative responsibilities that have been assigned, you could end up with a rank of lieutenant colonel, and then you proceed from there depending on future kinds of appointments to colonel and possibly commissioner and then the general. So to make it easy, really, I'm talking today to the bishops of the Salvation Army in Newfoundland and Labrador, for those of you that may come from a different church tradition that understands that terminology. And so it's my pleasure to welcome Eddie and Ginevra Vincent to our set. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, you weren't always Lieutenant Colonel, were you?
No, we were
No,
not.
indeed.
And
No, we're
there
not.
was a point in time when you were Eddie from Triton,
Yeah.
and you were Ginevra from Monkstown.
Indeed.
Want to take us back to those early days in your lives and those beginnings of life and of faith and what that all meant for you, where you came from. So, Ginevra, why don't we start with you?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes, I was born and raised in Monkstown on the Burin Peninsula, just a little tiny community that was all Salvation Army. The Salvation Army Church was the only church in the community, and a little Salvation Army community nestled in amongst Roman Catholic communities dotted around the area. And I was born in, born and come by chance, but grew up in Monkstown, and a part of the church all my life. I mean, it was.
What kind of programs would you have had?
Oh my
back in
goodness!
those days?
Back as a child, of course, it was the traditional Sunday school YP meetings that a lot of people, you would be very familiar with, YP meetings, youth group, and church itself, church attendance on a Sunday morning, a Sunday night, open airs, all of the above that were very much a part of my history and really, I think, made me what I am today.
Good.
Yeah,
good.
certainly.
And then to that Salvation Army hotspot called Triton. And there are untold numbers of Salvation Army officers to have come out of Triton. Why don't you take us back and share with us some of your recollections of those days?
Sure, yeah. Well, I grew up in the small community of Triton, out in the Green Bay area. And my father was a fisherman, and I often say to people that I grew up in the boat with my dad.
Yes?
And that would be accurate. That was my
Early
history.
mornings?
Very early mornings when I wasn't going to school, Saturday mornings, and then summertime, of course. I spent my days out in the boat with my dad, and thoroughly enjoyed it. I never intended to make that a life dream for me, but enjoyed it while I was young and with him. From the church perspective, kind of like Ginevra, born and raised in the church, in the Salvation Army, and again, active in many of the programs, obviously going to church. Although I was probably a little different than Ginevra. When she was growing up, she did everything she could to get to church, and I probably did everything I could to try and get out of going to church. So we were quite different in that area, but yet church was a vital part of my growing up and the formation of my life and who I am, and to this day, very much involved in youth group activities. We had the Corps Cadet program then, which was probably a very important part of my life, because that was kind of a teen discipleship program.
Yes.
And I recall learning lots, and that became a critical part of my spiritual development as a teenager. And so yes, being part of the Corps meetings, youth meetings, as Ginevra had spoken about, and under the influence of tremendously godly people who I looked to as leaders and mentors and coaches, even though they didn't know it, unofficially and informally, that's what they were, and they had a tremendous impact on my life growing up.
You put it kind of nicely. On the one hand, Ginevra was trying to get to church.
Yes.
And you, on the other hand, were trying to get away from church, or not go, or whatever. And part of that is the boy in you at the time. Part of it might have been just natural kind of questioning and, you know, loosely put rebellion and all of that stuff, right?
Yeah.
However, we know that we don't come to faith based on our family name.
Right.
We come to faith as a personal decision.
Absolutely.
And so it's interesting in that dynamic that you're describing, but now I'd like you to put a pin up point on it and say, how did you know, and when did you know, that faith had to be a personal thing for you going forward, and it was going to play a role in your life going forward? How did you know that, and when? Ginevra?
Well, I think, Derek, I always knew. I mean, from my earliest recollections as a very, very young child, even before I made a decision to follow Jesus, I knew about Jesus, and of course, as a 7-year-old, I made a commitment of my life to Jesus in a decision Sunday in Sunday school. But even before that, I was following Jesus. Even before that, I was following Jesus. But as that 7-year-old, with cadets from the St Johns Training College visiting our Corps, and one of the cadets came, spoke to me, and if I could take you back now to that old church in Monkstown, I could actually show you the very spot that I knelt at the altar with a friend of mine as this cadet, Jeanette Martin, she was at that time, Jeanette Foss now, led us both to the Lord on that Sunday afternoon. And I remember running home that day from Sunday school, because in her prayer with us at the altar at that time was, you know, when you go home, you know, you find a spot, you pray a prayer, you continue that relationship. That's how you build. And so I couldn't wait to get home from Sunday school that day, ran to my room, knelt at my bed, prayed a very simple prayer that God would keep me good. And I would say from that day on, really, I had a calling, and maybe we'll talk about that a bit later, but I had a calling on my life to, I would always say, and whenever I was asked, what are you going to be when you grow up? It was never a nurse or whatever. It was always Salvation Army officer. I never changed from that, from the time I was a very little girl, maybe even 4 or 5 years old. I was asked that question, and would say, and that followed me, and I truly believe that it was a childhood calling.
It's very interesting. You know, in the Salvation Army, we believe in child evangelism. And there are untold stories of people who began in a very childlike way,
Yes.
At somebody's knee or at a formal altar or whatever, to understand what could be understood at 7 or 6 or whatever.
Yes.
but then time passes and you mature in that faith if the conditions are correct.
Yes.
Right? So yeah, that's very interesting. How about you, sir?
I can remember to this day, Derek, when I was just 6 years of age in a Sunday evening service. So somebody managed to get me out to the church that night, and I went forward and I knelt at the mercy seat, and my great aunt, who was the young people's sergeant major, probably more familiar today as a youth director in a church, and she came, knelt with me, and that was the point and the a time when I recognized and acknowledged that I made my first commitment to the Lord. And that was a significant time for me, one that I've never forgotten. And even though through the subsequent years, I might have not been so sold out to going to church, and as I mentioned, do what I can to kind of get away from it, from attending, yet that element of faith and that awareness of God was always there. But for me, it was when I was in my mid-teens, around 15 years of age. This is where really a spiritual awakening took place in my life. And I remember I was a leader at a cub camp at the old Silver Birches camp in western Newfoundland, and that followed a Corps Cadet camp. And so I stayed on for the Corps Cadet camp, and it was during that weekend where I really sensed and had a real epiphany, I guess, and my spiritual awakening started on that weekend, where I finally connected on a personal level with God. And after that, I wasn't trying to get away from church. I became more like Ginevra, and I was doing everything I can to get to church and be part of the fellowship of faith.
Good. And then, subsequent, at this point in time, you didn't know each other, did you?
No.
No.
We didn't.
And so, somewhere in Monkstown, you already knew that you were on a journey, and you were coming to 21 Adams Avenue or wherever,
Yes.
right? Which is the old training college
Yes.
back in those days. It's gone through a lot of iterations since then, but. So you knew that was going to be the case for you. How was your calling confirmed, and how did you know that this was going to happen? Let's start with you first.
Sure. Well, I had no desire through my life and through my early teen years to be a Salvation Army officer. If you had known me then, and if anybody in the Corps who knew me, they would have said, Eddie Vincent, be a Salvation Army officer? I don't think so. My ambition was to become an officer, all right, but an RCMP officer. My desire was to go into the police force. But it was around those mid-teen years when that spiritual awakening happened, and probably maybe a year or two into moving deeper into that spiritual life. It was then I started to sense God's call. I remember making my prayer to God and saying, God, I know you want me to be a police officer, not a Salvation Army officer.
Don't you, God?
I was trying. I was trying
God?
to make God's will my will, or my will God's will.
Yeah.
And but anyway, through a series of happenings and events, I really sensed God speaking to my heart and saying, no, this is what I want you to do. And for me, it really came kind of in the form of a vision. And I remember in bed at night, and I don't know if I was dreaming or having a vision, but I can still remember being awake and seeing myself standing and preaching the gospel. Now that was totally out of character for me. And eventually
Shy, reserved.
Very shy and reserved. And eventually I was reading my scriptures, reading the Bible, and I said, God, if this is what you want me to do, please confirm it. And God directed me to Matthew chapter 9. And the passage of Scripture where Jesus says, truly the harvest is great, and the laborers are few. Pray to the Lord of the harvest that he will send forth laborers into the field. Now, anybody can read that. Doesn't mean that's a calling to officership. But for me at that point, that's the verses God used to speak to me and say, this is what I want you to do. From there on, it was yes.
Yep. And so for you now, the confirmation. Well, you knew, but what was the confirmation?
And mine, I mean, Eddie's seems a bit more dramatic, I think, than mine. Mine was just a constant awareness and just a growing into a knowledge that, yes, God has called me. I believe that as a very young child, that a calling was placed on my life to be a Salvation Army officer. And I think that call was confirmed. Eddie mentioned the Corps Cadet program. That was a significant program for me, the 5 years of Corps Cadetship. It was an absolute growing time for me. And in that little Corps in Monkstown, just such faithful followers of God who spoke into my life, and who, I think, the confirmation of the call to officership came through a lot of people who would, elderly people, who would just pat you on the head and say, oh, one day you're going to be a Salvation Army officer. And just, I think, that awareness, that calling. So I guess probably around the same time that Eddie, at 14, 15, I absolutely knew without a doubt. There were no doubts in my mind whatsoever. When the time was right, when school was finished, when the time was right, I would be at 21 Adams Avenue as a cadet. I mean, I just knew that.
These two roads that
Yeah.
started in Monkstown and in Triton converged in 21 Adams Avenue.
Yes.
Exactly.
The rest is history. Where has this life of officership taken you? Thumbnail sketch.
It's
Thumbnail
been,
sketch.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey, a fabulous adventure, one that we would never have dreamed of, but one we celebrate and thank God for each day, and thankful to the Army, because the Army has seen fit to place us in various appointments. We had 19 years as Corps officers, pastors of a congregation, and that included, of course, Ginevra, for her first year out of training college, was here, assisting at St Johns Citadel.
That's the route.
And I
the
was,
route.
and I was at the other Corps in the city, St. John's Temple, assisting at the same time.
Yeah.
And so after a year, we got married, moved to Winterton out in Trinity Bay.
Right.
That was our first married Corps. We had 4 years there. We had 3 years in Bay Roberts. We had 6 years at Woodruff Temple in Ottawa, Ontario. We had 5 years at Glenmore Temple in Calgary, Alberta. Aside from our Corps ministry, we had 7 years as divisional youth leaders. The first 4 here in Newfoundland East Division at that time. We ran Camp Starigan. And then we had 3 years, not immediately after that, but later we had another 3 years in the Alberta Division. From there, we served at Territorial Headquarters in Toronto in the Personnel Department. I was the Officer Personnel Secretary. Ginevra was the Assistant Officer Personnel Secretary. Then 2016, we came here to Newfoundland as divisional leaders and have thoroughly enjoyed our time here at this point.
Very, very diverse. And when you just throw Triton and Monkstown into the mix as your beginning points, St. John's Temple, St. John's Citadel, that's a little different. And then on you go, right? So it's been quite a journey. And so you have children.
We do. We have.
And they went with you, as all good little children do, but they grow up, don't they?
They grow up, and we always say we left home. When we moved to Calgary, our youngest son at the time, this was 2007, our youngest son was 14, and our oldest son was 18. And so, of course, both moved to Calgary with us. And but after our 5 years at the Corps there, we got moved to, as Eddie said, to THQ. And so we left home, and our boys stayed. Both boys stayed in Calgary, and they are there still today. Our oldest son, Stephen, and his wife Melanie are very involved at Glenmore Temple. And Stephen is a firefighter with the City of Calgary, and his wife Melanie, a preschool teacher. And so they're making their lives in Calgary. And our youngest son, Ryan, is in the IT world and working right now with a robotics company in Calgary. And so very proud of our sons, very proud of our sons.
Of course
and
you are.
yeah,
Every reason to be.
Yes.
That's great. So then you come back here. And specifically, I know the life of divisional leaders is you're pulled one place and another. You're all over the place. But you do have a church base. And so you selected St. Johns Citadel as a church base for coming back here. Now I think I know the route. But this is a vibrant church. It's, I think, a church in transition, as all churches are in transition these days. And of course, COVID, we're coming out of that and learning how to deal with it and what the new church looks like and what's required of us in this new time and all of that. Okay. So, but I have, seen you come to worship here. We've shared worship together here. And what is it about St. John's Citadel? Is there something in particular that speaks to you? I mean, I know you have an allegiance to all of them out there. I realize that. But for whatever reason, you decided when we're in town, this is going to be it. So what is it? What is it St. John's Citadel offers you?
Yeah, I'll let you never start because she's got the history here more than I do.
Derek, as you say, I mean, we could have chosen,
Anywhere.
I guess, anywhere. Now, at the time when we moved here 6 years ago, my cousin was attending here, and we said, Marilyn is attending. We'll go to the Citadel, and it was no hardship to think of coming to St. John's Citadel. I remember my year, just 1 year that I had, and yet that was a very, it was a life-changing year for me, actually, to be here at St. John's Citadel. And, the people that were involved at the core at the time, my goodness, like it was really, it was something for me. And so it was no hardship to come to the Citadel. And I think as you said, the vibrancy of worship certainly was, something that resonated and spoke to us, and been very happy to be a part of the core.
Because, the caregiver has to be cared for.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's the whole role and the goal here, right? We'll
Absolutely.
talk about being the caregiver in just a moment. But,
Yeah.
you also have to have something
Have to be cared for.
keep the tank full. Right?
Definitely.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we felt very cared for.
Good.
Yeah.
About you, sir?
Well, I still get ribbed a little bit by people from St. John's Temple who are wondering why we did not soldier at St. John's Temple. And but it's all in good fun because as Ginevra
He blames
said,
me.
Yeah, I blame
It's
her.
convenient.
When we look around the city, we could have chosen any one of our core, and they would have been fabulous places to soldier.
go. Yeah.
But Ginevra's shared with you, why we decided on the Citadel, and we've not regretted that. We've certainly enjoyed it.
Yes.
Fabulous people here,
Yeah.
enjoying the ministry, and as you said, for us, our first years here prior to the pandemic, we did a lot of travel in the division, so the Corps didn't see much of us anyway.
No.
Since
They got our tithe. They always get our tithe.
Got our tithe. But since
Glad to hear that.
since the pandemic, we've been around here more than we normally would have been because travel has been
Of
limited.
course.
Yes.
But it's been very good for us because we feel that we really have been fed from the Word, from the Corps officers. We've enjoyed that. We've enjoyed the fellowship with the folk here.
Yes.
So it's been a rich experience for us, and really an important part of our own spiritual well-being and self-care.
Let's just move into your function. You are the leaders of the Salvation Army in this province. And so you can correct me now because I have no concept of the numbers, but what's the numbers of officers that you have responsibility for in this province these days?
We're over 100 active officers, and in this division, over 200 retired officers.
Right.
And we have, of course, a number of retired officers who are
Come back.
doing active service, and so we consider they're retired, but we consider them our active officer force.
And in addition to that, we have a number of lay folk
ministry unit
who are
leaders.
ministry unit leaders who are doing fabulous work in the division for
Yeah.
us.
Yeah.
So you are the pastor's pastor. I'll put it in that context. Every one of them have their high points, their low points, their challenges, their blessings, all of it. It's the mixed bag, and that phone can ring or the text can come, or whatever. And by virtue of position, perhaps, you're looked to. I guess my question is, how do you care for yourselves spiritually so that you can speak into the lives of others meaningfully? The reasonable question to ask you?
Absolutely.
Critical question, in fact.
Shoot.
You go ahead.
Okay, all right.
Ladies first.
Well, I would say, Derek, that from the perspective of being, an encourager to others or speaking into someone else's spiritual life, you can't do that from a place of emptiness. And so that, for us, is, our spiritual walk with God is very real. It is very current. It is not something that we look at that happened years ago. It's a daily relationship. It's a daily surrender. It's a daily into the Word and times of prayer. And I have to say, for both of us, first thing in the morning, before we leave for work, there's a time of scripture and prayer and listening to God that has been absolutely foundational, critical to who we are as children of God, and because you can't give out what you don't have. And so it's very important to have that spiritual foundation, always been important in our lives, but certainly knowing that, we are first and foremost children of God. And in order to really give out, we have to take in. And we can't wait for a Sunday morning to come and listen to a sermon for that. That has to be a daily exercise for us. So very, very important in our lives.
Formations, right?
Spiritual formations.
Really, being divisional leaders, that's not who we are.
No.
It's what we do.
That's what we do.
Who we are, as Ginevra said, we are children of God. And being children of God, we need to establish and maintain that vital relationship. As Jesus says in John, talks about him being the vine, we are the branches. And so for ourselves, we recognize that need. If we're going to be branches on the vine, then we've got to maintain that connection with them, or else we're not going to be of any value to ourselves, to the division, to our officers, to our lay people. And so we make that a priority in our lives every day before we head out the door to go to work, wherever we might be going. I pray for a daily cleansing. If there's anything in my life that needs to be cleansed, Lord, cleanse it. I pray for God's direction. Not knowing what's going to be before me that day, I simply say, God, I don't know what's before me, but you do. I'm looking to you. Give me your wisdom, give me your direction for whatever it is that's going to be facing me today. And so that is a regular daily practice, and is not just something that you do to check the box.
No.
It's something I do because just as I need water, just as I need food, physically, to survive. I need that relationship with God in order to be what He wants me to be.
And I think, and I was going to say, and in addition, I think too, the spiritual part, I mean, we recognize that we are spiritual beings, we're physical beings, emotional. And so it's really, I think, a part of how we care for ourselves so that we can care for others is really being very intentional about self-care as well. And being able to turn off work when you have to. It's very difficult at times, but having that ability to say, okay, that can wait, because we need to replenish right now, and it's very, very important. And walking, healthy eating, that's been very important for us as well.
You can't always live in that little box called urgent.
No,
Absolutely.
no.
You have to step out of that.
You got to step out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Salvation Army services are known for encouragement and to extending an invitation of sorts for people to consider the place of God in their lives. As we conclude today, there may be folks listening to us who are struggling with faith. As we said, when you first sat before the lights came on and we went into full-blown mode here, people can get the impression from those of us that are, your church-going Christian types, that you must be all buttoned up, is the term that you used. And in other words, they're all together. They've got it together. It's nothing that's going to faze that crowd. And that is not entirely the case.
No.
You, in another response, said it's a day-to-day thing, and it is. So if there's somebody out there who's struggling with faith, what would you have to say to them today as we conclude?
I remember when we were at Woodruff Temple, and I did a sermon there one Sunday morning, I think it was. And I can't remember the details of it, but I remember a statement I made to the congregation. And I said to them, in reality, we're all basket cases. Now, I hope that doesn't insult anybody when I say that, but my reference is simply to the fact that it doesn't matter who we are, whether we are wearing this uniform or whether we are not wearing this uniform, whatever our background is, we all have our issues. None of us are perfect. And so I don't think God expects us to be perfect in this life in the sense that we won't have struggles, we won't have flaws. That's the reality of life. But my encouragement to anybody who might be struggling with this is to recognize, first of all, I'm not alone in this. What I'm experiencing, in reality, most all of us have experienced or will experience. But in all of that, from my own personal experience, and Jennifer will speak to hers, from my own personal experience, I would never have been able to survive or thrive or any of this without placing my total dependence on God, surrendering my life to Him, and saying, here I am, take me, make me, use me in whatever way you wish. And even through that, there have been some very difficult moments, days when I wondered, am I going to make it through this or not? But God has always proven to be faithful, even at times when I couldn't hear Him. He's never been far away. And eventually, being patient, waiting it out sometimes, and looking to other people, other faithful, godly people that are around us, God can use these folk to speak into our lives as well, in a way sometimes that we underestimate.
Final word.
When you asked that question, actually, there's a quote from the French mathematician, Catholic theologian Blaise Pascal, who said, in every human, there is a God-shaped vacuum that only can be filled by Jesus Christ. And I think, as you think about that, we think about, the people who try to fill their lives with so many things and try to fill a void, even Christian people, I think, who try to fill a void and try to fill a void. And I think, so my word actually would be to understand that every human being is designed with a God-shaped vacuum in our lives that can't be filled by anything or anyone else, no matter how much we feel that, as a married couple, you complete each other, or in whatever way, there is within all of us a place, a void that only God can fill. And so surrender. I would just say surrender to His will and His way, and as Eddie said, allow Him to speak through others. We don't, if we're listening for that audible voice, well, no, I mean that may never come, but His voice will come through others, through a simple gesture or just a word, and so be open.
Well, we've been exploring the intersection of life and faith in our time together today, and I know that it's been an encouragement to those that are viewing and will view, and I want to say thank you very much for making time and to giving of yourselves in this way to share with us in these few moments. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah,
It's been
a
great.
privilege to share with you.
Yes, thank you.